Here we are, finally at the last episode of What If Season 1. What if the Watcher broke his oath? This is where it all comes together. These individual episodes cross over for the epic finale. They really didn't need to do this. It could have just been an anthology show, with this episode giving more time to another episode that apparently sorely needed it. Because one of the most common defenses I get is that they just needed more than 30 minutes for some of these storylines. But hey, maybe it ties everything together well. Let's take a look. Quick note, this show uses the term universe a whole lot, but the wider MCU has made that terminology inaccurate for reasons I don't care to get into at this point. So even though the characters say universe, I will mostly be sticking to the word timeline. When I use the word universe, I will be referring to the spatial universe, not the current MCU's concept of what a universe is. We open to Captain Carter's equivalent of the events of The Winter Soldier. And I guess, since Zola was captured in her episode, it's possible that this mission would still be a thing. Although, it's strange that everything lined up like this with nearly 70 years of difference. And of course, they throw in another line about dancing.
I'm a pretty good dancer, too.
And have poorly choreographed action where everyone seems to be deaf, nobody ever shoots at her. Then she fights Batroc one-on-one, doing the "I thought you were more than just a shield" bit from The Winter Soldier. Except she only took out like 5 of the 20 or so pirates, so extending this fight could result in her getting shot by someone from elsewhere, and is slowing down the mission unnecessarily, rather than dealing swiftly with Batroc and moving on to neutralize the other pirates. Here, she's risking the mission's success for no reason. Also, her hits on Batroc are way weaker than they should be, by the way, considering she's a super soldier. The Watcher shows up to say,
"Captain Carter, the soldier lost in time. You have been chosen."
Then we see Ego using the Peter Quill we saw from episode 2 as a battery. But the goo isn't rapidly expanding, even though that's what using him as a battery like this was for. Then T'Challa grabs him and bombs Ego. After which, the Watcher appears and says,
"Star-Lord T'Challa, leader of the Ravagers and lost prince of Wakanda, you have been chosen."
Then we go to Nidavellir to see the Infinity Gauntlet being melted down. We zoom out to see Eitri, Gamora, and Tony in a new suit. If you don't remember this episode, that's because it was postponed, then put in Season 2. The Watcher appears and says,
"Gamora, survivor of Sakaar and destroyer of Thanos, you, Gamora, have been chosen."
He goes to Killmonger, who Pepper and Shuri are headed to attack. There's no way Pepper would bring along a child for this fight, much less to be at the front of this fight, so that's another character that's out of character. But anyway, the Watcher says,
"Eric Stevens, Killmonger, Tony Stark's former protege and killer, you have been chosen."
Then we cut to Party Thor fighting sub-Ultron bots, despite the fact that we saw Infinity Ultron, that's what I'm going to call him from now on, enter his timeline right in front of him. Thor should already be dead, as should his entire timeline. But I guess Infinity Ultron just showed up, then immediately dipped, instead of destroying his universe, or at least the Earth, which he can do with ease. The Watcher then plucks Thor out of his timeline mid-fight.
"Thor Odinson, Crown Prince of Asgard, you've been chosen."
The Watcher needed all these people, but there was no reason for him to exposit who they are, then tell each of them they've been chosen before taking them. He's going to explain what's going on later, so that's just wasting precious time and letting more of the multiverse get destroyed by Infinity Ultron. They're in a pub, which Strange Supreme says is because
the pub facade was my idea.
The Watcher appears, not sure what he was doing between grabbing Thor and appearing now. He should have just immediately been here. He says that he first looked for one hero, but then realized this mission needed a team.
"The perfect combination of skills and experience that alone will triumph."
You expect me to believe that out of the entire multiverse, these 6 are the best you could find? Strange Supreme is the best and strongest choice here. But morally, he's off the deep end, so choosing him is quite the risk. With his timeline and Christine gone, his motivations are a complete mystery. Party Thor is fairly strong considering he's Thor, but any other version of Thor would be a better option. Normal Thor, a more experienced Thor, Thor with Stormbreaker? No? Okay. 3 superhumans, stronger than the average person, but as far as beings across the multiverse go, not that impressive. And Killmonger isn't even questionable in his motivations. He's just a straight up villain. Then T'Challa Star-Lord. He left Wakanda as a kid, meaning he wasn't the Black Panther yet, meaning he's just a regular guy. 4 of your options would do absolutely nothing against Infinity Ultron. 3 of them would be unable to even touch him if he just flew high enough. Across the multiverse, you have Captain Marvel's, Thor's, Doctor Strange's, Scarlet Witch's, and more, who, if they are anything like their sacred timeline selves, would be more than willing to help save the multiverse. For that matter, Thanos is the villain in Infinity War, but he does what he does for the sake of all life. If a Thanos with 6 stones was brought here, he would certainly be willing to help when the stakes are the end of life in the multiverse. It's not like there's a limit. You could grab multiple of each of these extremely strong beings to combat this one Ultron who only has 6 stones, which is easy to outnumber given the whole multiverse, where each timeline has 6 stones. Or just use your bubbling power to snatch a full gauntlet off of a Thanos, and give it to Thor or someone else more benevolent that could wield it. There are so many options with more skills and experience than this pathetic team. Behold, your Guardians of the Multiverse. Captain Carter asks if they're here to save the universe, so the Watcher drops the existential bomb on them that there is a multiverse, and they were brought here to save it. Not sure why none of them has a single question when this info is dropped on them, but Thor says this is a trick orchestrated by Loki, even though Loki in his timeline was not raised by Frigga and thus would not know how to do magic or illusions. Then says that he is going to leave now. When Thor opens the door, there's a vortex that he barely doesn't get sucked into. Not sure why, if this place was a facade, you would design it to have a door out to that vortex. You don't need any doors, considering the Watcher can just teleport people in and out, and there's nowhere directly outside worth going to. They talk about what they're up against, then start planning, mentioning how Party Thor would be good for getting Ultron's attention, and how they have an Infinity Crusher to destroy the stones. Captain Carter repeats the plan after they put it all together.
Get the Soul Stone and get it to Gamora. We'll hold the line, and then she'll unleash the Crusher.
If you're getting a stone off of him, why that one? They're all going to be equally difficult to get off other than the Mind Stone, but once whichever stone you choose is off, certain stones will leave him at more of a deficit than others. The Power, Space, Reality, and Time Stone all offer more abilities he can use to fight you, so surely you would want to take one of those, so that after you get the stone off, you are less likely to be killed by him. Then the Watcher sends them off. Strange is setting up a spell as Gamora asks,
"This place is safe?"
to which Strange responds,
Apparently, there's not enough intelligent life here to attract Ultron.
which is a poor excuse considering Infinity Ultron said his purpose was
The elimination of all life.
not just intelligent life, but whatever, I guess he can't find them here. They have a toast, then Thor summons lightning, which gets Ultron's attention. Then he says,
So, there is life in this universe.
even though Strange's wording seemed to imply that there undoubtedly was life here, just not much, if any, intelligent life. And Ultron so immediately discovering them from this one lightning strike means one of 2 things, both of which reflect extremely poorly on his characterization. Possibility 1 is that he is now omniscient or near omniscient, so he doesn't even have to be paying attention to a timeline to notice that there are things happening anywhere in it. But if he has this level of awareness, that creates more problems with him never finding Clint and Natasha, as well as causing major problems for how the rest of the episode plays out, because there are tons of things that catch him off guard. So the other option is that he was for some reason paying attention to this timeline when this happened, which is infinitely contrived and also against his character, because there are many timelines he knows have life and would be focused on plowing through right now. It's not like he has already eliminated the entire multiverse, because otherwise our hero's already lost. But even in both of these cases, how does a weather event in one spot out of the entire timeline that could occur naturally catch his attention? Strange puts a protection spell on them, but there was no reason for him to set it up here, rather than at the fake pub, where Ultron absolutely couldn't find them. They almost got attacked before Strange finished setting up the spell, which would have been very, very bad. Also, Infinity Ultron, after flying in, just kind of floats there while doing nothing, allowing this spell to happen and the Guardians of the Multiverse to make their preparations. Thor zaps him with lightning, which does nothing. Then Infinity Ultron destroys the ground beneath them using the Power, Reality, and Soul Stone? That's a strange combination. You'd think he'd only need the Power Stone to do this, like Thanos destroying Asgard's ship at the start of Infinity War. The Soul Stone isn't even remotely related to destroying the ground here. After the mountain has caved in on them, he says,
All too easy.
And starts leaving. How does he think that killed them? Surely he could sense for life now that he can see as much as he does? Or at least create some tech that can scan for life, like Clint had last episode.
Scans show nothing alive.
Instead, he is unaware that what he just didn't kill these guys. And if he has no way of knowing he's not going to check, he could clear out the rubble just to make sure. When they emerge, he says,
Interesting. Usually you people are much easier to kill.
Which is dumb because one of these people is Thor, who would not be killed by this even without the protection spell. Also, after he says this, he again just floats in place and does nothing rather than attacking them again. So Thor throws Mjolnir, which Strange duplicates until there are a bunch of them around Ultron, who just stays there and takes it rather than teleporting away. Then they attack him multiple times while he is distracted by the hammers, leading to T'Challa snatching the Soul Stone off of him. Not sure why, with all the power Infinity Ultron has, he didn't add an outer layer to his armor around the stones to prevent any regular strength person from simply plucking them off of him. This is a massive oversight, which allows our heroes to win. Also, if it's that easy to just pluck them off, surely Strange could do that to all of them with telekinesis no problem, making Ultron only as powerful as Vision, who they could easily take down. But nah, they just used T'Challa to take the one. After a bit, Ultron realizes the stone got taken, not sure how he didn't immediately sense that such an immense amount of power was taken off of him, given how Thanos reacts every time he gains a stone, and how Ultron can see everything once he gains the 6 stones. Surely Ultron would feel the reverse effect and immediately realize that a stone has been taken from him. Also, once he realizes that, he should just be able to go,
Yeah, it's rewind time.
In fact, anytime something happens in this fight that he doesn't like, he can do that, as can Strange Supreme, but neither of them ever do. Strange and Thor continue to attack him while the others run off. Not sure why they need to run anywhere when the Watcher has portals, but anyway. As Ultron is about to up his game, because starting fights with your best move that will win is lame, Strange drops the zombies on him with a portal. So, there's no way this timeline was the zombie timeline, because it was believed to have no life by Ultron, even though the zombies, who are on Earth, the first place he would check, are life, and are even intelligent life, considering the things we see them do in the zombie episode. And that timeline was the same as the mainline MCU up to 2018, so there would be plenty of life across the universe, plus the survivors from that episode. So that means Strange Supreme used a sling ring to portal to another timeline. That is not possible. I know they say sling rings are used to travel the multiverse and Doctor Strange, but that was before Loki's poorly explained retcon that what the sorcerers are talking about, the dimensions, are not the full extent of the multiverse. I go into this more in depth in my video on Loki Season 1. Sling rings cannot travel across timelines. This is a major contradiction to the world building that one is doing it here. If they could, then how is he stuck in his own little bubble timeline rather than just portaling to another one? As the Guardians of the Multiverse leave, Infinity Ultron blows up the zombies, then gets attacked by zombie Scarlet Witch, then blows up the planet. The others arrive through the portal and throw the stone to Gamora, but Black Widow from last episode drives in and catches it. Not sure how her motorcycle was completely silent up to that point, so none of them noticed her. This creates a standoff even though all she has is a gun and they just survived this, so they could totally just rush her and take the stone. But instead, Captain Carter says,
Stand down.
Because she knows Natasha, or at least her own Natasha, so she explains they're here to stop Ultron and tells her,
Your father is Ivan, your Dar's Alexei.
which for one, it's contrived that this is convincing, because they are from timelines that differ starting from the 40s. It's entirely possible, even probable, that Alexei was named differently, or that a different man was chosen to be the Red Guardian, or that it wasn't the Red Guardian who was chosen as her fake dad, and so on. But I guess their timelines just happened to be extremely similar, as we see when the start of this episode is basically the start of the Winter Soldier. But also, Natasha doesn't know that her dad is Ivan. Natasha never knew who her biological dad was until Red Skull told her in Endgame.
Because you know your dad's name?
I didn't.
And if the timelines are really as similar as they need to be for this to work, then Peggy's Natasha wouldn't know her dad is Ivan. So it's not possible for Peggy to know this. Off of this, Peggy says that she is one of the few people her Natasha trusts. So Natasha says,
Well, we must be close.
Ultron immediately finds them, then tries to take the stone back, only for Thor to knock his arm off, which drops the stone and Natasha. Not sure why Ultron is so preoccupied on having this stone when there are plenty of soul stones out there in the multiverse, which he could have collected last episode or this episode, by the way. Not sure why he just stuck to 6. But also, how did he get here without the soul stone? Is multiversal travel possible without all 6 stones? All 6 stones combined having the ability to travel the multiverse was already nonsense, but at least all 6 stones gave some nebulous extra level of power, as we saw in Infinity War, where even the stones that are seemingly unrelated contributed to Thanos' snap. It makes even less sense that Ultron would be able to travel the multiverse with 5. Ultron keeps blasting them with different stuff, then says,
I can destroy galaxies with a thought.
Which brings up the same questions as last episode. If he's that powerful, how has he not already won? Just snap them, or destroy this galaxy, or at least the planet, like he did a few minutes ago, so they don't have ground to stand on. Don't stick to just beams of energy. He then finally blows up the entire galaxy, but Strange Supreme just eats it.
Wait, what?
The level of nonsense is even confusing the characters at this point. I guess we can't say it's impossible that Strange Supreme can do that, but that's just because the power levels and stakes are so undefined. The explosion seemed to happen in reverse before he eats it, but he didn't use the time stone for this, because that would make sense. He just picked up the explosion in his hand and then ate it. Well, anyway, even if he can do that, Ultron could instantly crumble the planet like he destroyed the mountain earlier, meaning they would have no ground to stand on, and those of them that can't fly would be useless. And pretty much everyone is unlikely to survive the debris or the vacuum of space. Then T'Challa grabs Ultron and sumo slams him through a building. Keep in mind that T'Challa here is just a regular guy. No way he's strong enough to pick up Ultron or swing him around like this. Infinity Ultron knocks him out of the building, and he knocks into Thor and Gamora, who are running to the stone even though Thor can fly faster than he can run. Then Ultron sprints to the stone, which is the funniest looking thing ever. He can fly, teleport, or pull the stone to him like he did earlier, yet he's just running to it. Natasha and Peggy start throwing their shields at him. By the way, he's been kicked around this whole episode, despite the fact that he's strong enough to overpower Captain Marvel like it's nothing. He shouldn't be knocked around so easily, nor should he even be taking hits because he can use the stones to shield himself. Everyone fights him one at a time, which isn't very smart on their part, when they could be blasting him from multiple sides at once. But also, again, this shouldn't affect him as much as it is, but it also shouldn't affect him at all, because keep in mind this is the Vision body. He can turn himself immaterial if he needs to. This applies to a bunch of times in the fight when he's hit. They just forgot about this mechanic of the Vision body. Then he slows everyone down with the Time Stone. Why didn't he start with that? That immediately gives him a massive upper hand. This is one of the many abilities he should have used way earlier to just start the fight winning. But Infinity Ultron grabs the Soul Stone at an extremely leisurely pace. I have no idea why he's going about it so slowly, and that sluggishness allows Strange Supreme to grab his hand with tentacles before he can put the Soul Stone back in place. Then, as Strange is stuck in this pose, the Eye of Agamotto suddenly opens and cancels the time field Ultron created. The Eye of Agamotto isn't something you can just use by thinking about it. It requires hand motions, which is why Ma was able to stop Strange from using it in Infinity War by holding his hands back. Strange Supreme couldn't use it here while stuck in this pose, not even having 2 hands at the moment because one of them is a tentacle. Ultron shrugs the tentacles off, then grows to massive size. The Soul Stone, which should be in Ultron's left hand, disappears during this part, which is a bit of a nitpick, But that's the main point of this fight. It's kind of important to keep track of where it is. And the only reason he stopped putting it into place was because Strange was holding him back, which he broke out of before growing. So he should have put it back into place while growing, but instead he just held it in his hand and gets put on pause as Strange takes a while to make giant tentacles that shrink Ultron back down and make him drop the stone. Strange then pins him to the ground that also spawns chains for Peggy, Killmonger, and Thor to hold, even though, again, two of these people's strength is nothing compared to Ultron's. And even Thor is still not that strong compared to him. The problem is, Ultron being held here, unable to move, shouldn't actually stop him from using the stones. In Infinity War, they were smart enough to give Thanos a limitation through him needing to close his fist to use the stones. Something our heroes pick up on, then constantly try to prevent him from doing.
Don't let him close his fist.
Ultron has no such limitation. He uses the stones from any pose he wishes. So holding him like this isn't actually going to prevent him from using them, but he just doesn't use them anyway. Gamora puts the Soul Stone in the Infinity Crusher, then it ambles over to Infinity Ultron and starts crushing his stones. Once it's done, there's a giant explosion. But Infinity Ultron isn't defeated. They can still hear his voice, and he says the reason it failed is because
Every universe is different, each one just a fraction unique. Thus, the Infinity Stones are unique.
as they have their Avengers moment, but trust me bro, you're not him. Gamora clarifies that what Ultron says means,
The Crusher was designed to destroy the stones on my world, not his.
which is a very strange thing to establish because now the MCU wants to have its cake and eat it too. So the stones came into being at the beginning of the timeline, and have power because they control their respective aspects of existence in that timeline. You would think that would mean they only work in their own timeline, but Endgame and this show establish that actually, you can take Infinity Stones across timelines and they still work just fine. So you'd think that now that that's established, the stones must be identical. The only way for stones that govern aspects of a certain timeline to also govern aspects of another would be because the stones you carry over are exactly the same as the ones from the timeline you carried them to, meaning they would have the same power. But nope, this episode says actually the Infinity Stones are unique in each timeline, which removes any reasoning they would have for being effective outside their own timeline. But even if we ignore that hole in the world building, the Infinity Crusher doesn't look particularly precise. It's a glorified shredder. How are you going to tell me that this thing relies on a very specific makeup of the stones to be able to destroy them? The stones have the same powers and look exactly the same across the multiverse. They're made out of the same stuff. I don't buy that some minor difference they made up here would actually stop the Crusher from doing its job. Also, the Crusher doesn't have anything here to destroy the Time Stone. It has the Shredder part for the Space, Reality, and Power Stone, and this little arm that comes out for the Mind Stone, but the spot on the armor where the Time Stone is gets left untouched. Guess they forgot about that when animating it. After rising into the air again, Infinity Ultron shoots them with a beam from all 6 stones, which they all survive, and the protection spell again becomes visible, which causes Infinity Ultron to say,
It's you. If I destroy you, you all fall.
Not sure how he hasn't realized that yet. The protection spell has been visible this whole time, and there's only one wizard here. It's quite clear who's doing it. The attacks Strange does look very similar to the protection spell that is around everyone. Ultron blasts Peggy and Natasha away, then Natasha spots the USB arrow with Zola in it. So this arrow and the bike have been here the whole time, and somehow the massive explosions and energy blasts have all missed them. Plus, this is a very convenient spot for Natasha and Peggy to land. Also, this arrow being here means that after the end of last episode, Natasha chose to take Zola out of the Sub-Ultron bot and back into an arrow, even though the Sub-Ultron bot had the ability to transmit Zola to anywhere in the observable universe, so that if Infinity Ultron ever showed up again, they could beam Zola into him. Like, seriously. Instant win versus I have to shoot this arrow at an omnipotent super being who I have no idea about the design of, nor whether he even has a port I could shoot the arrow into. Why would you take the second option? Natasha made some weird choices last episode, and I was teetering on the edge of marking her down as out of character, but this decision just throws her off a cliff. This is character assassination that such a tactical character would make such an insanely poor decision. Also, this has me thinking. Last episode, Natasha and Clint gave their location to the Ultron hive mind, and she is now the last person alive in her universe. So wouldn't Ultron bots just keep coming after her? Surely the ones Clint killed with the explosion last episode weren't all the Ultron bots in the universe. This episode just ignores that because this show is allergic to continuity. Well, for whatever reason, she put Zola back into the Arrow, so Peggy is now going to help her get Infinity Ultron with it. Natasha rides up buildings on her motorcycle as Peggy runs up buildings. Then Natasha hits a jump and shoots the Arrow, as Peggy does a jump and lands on Infinity Ultron, pulling his helmet back so that the arrow can pierce his eye, plugging in and injecting Zola, who overtakes Infinity Ultron, causing his body to fall to the ground. Remember my video on last episode where I said, not exaggerating, I think this is the single laziest moment of writing that I have ever seen. Well, the reason I wasn't definitive on that is because this moment exists. Peggy jumps way farther than she possibly could. Even with the Super Soldier Serum, that's an insane distance. To land on Infinity Ultron and pull back his helmet, something even Captain Marvel wasn't strong enough to do, and this allows Natasha's shot with a bow and arrow while hitting a jump at full speed on a motorcycle aimed at a barely visible glowing ball of light to land exactly in Infinity Ultron's eye, despite it shifting locations unpredictably due to Peggy after the shot was fired, allowing the USB arrow to break through Infinity Ultron's vibranium eye and plug into the socket that is, for some reason, in an unreachable location behind the eye. The arrow was spinning, by the way, so it spun into the exact right orientation to plug into the socket. Hawkeye has hit some pretty insane shots in the MCU. If I saw him hit this shot, I would probably consider it a plot hole. Not even he is good enough to account for all these different factors, especially the unknowns, like how exactly Peggy pulling Ultron's head moves where his eye is. But this isn't even Hawkeye. This is Natasha, who's not even a perfect shot with her weapon of choice, a gun. With a bow and arrow, there is no way she's hitting this shot. And even if her aim was absolutely perfect, or she got insanely lucky, the Vision body is made out of vibranium. His eye isn't going to get shattered by a USB arrow while the arrow stays intact. And even if it was, the USB port behind the eye thing again? Really? Why would Ultron ever want to do that? And if all that nonsense wasn't enough, this leads to Ultron getting taken out by an AI from the 70s. An artificial intelligence, partially drawn from the Mind Stone, and partially created by two of the smartest people on the planet in 2015, losing to a dinky little AI from 40 years earlier that can fit inside a single USB arrow? And are you telling me Ultron has no firewall, so any program that gets plugged into his eye immediately gets run? This final moment that allows them to beat Infinity Ultron is all just so nonsensical. But it's not over, because despite everyone still recovering from that blast, Killmonger somehow is A-OK and walks over with a sub-Ultron head in his hand. It lights up, then the armor around the Vision body deconstructs and forms around Killmonger. This is not something you can just do if you're holding a sub-Ultron head. It's not like it's a remote or something. Once the armor forms around him, so that he has the power of 5 Infinity Stones coursing through him, he should just die. No human, even an enhanced one, could wield 5 stones like this. He tells everyone that they can use the stones to make their home universes better, but nobody sides with him, so he starts using all 5 of the stones to attack them. Again, he would just immediately die from trying to use 5 Infinity Stones. But anyway, Zola has now taken over the Vision body and its stomach is now his face. I don't think Vision has green lights on him that would make him able to look like this, but anyway, Zola takes the stones back, which Killmonger fights against, despite not having the head anymore, which was the only reason he could control these nanites in the first place. Then Strange Supreme encapsulates both of them in a bubble, like he did with himself and Christine in his episode. After this, Strange is watching over the bubble with the Watcher, and he says,
You foresaw every moment.
We'll come back to that. Then the Watcher sends everyone home except Natasha, who he sends to the timeline from episode 3, where she kicks Loki. Remember when even Captain America could barely hurt this guy? And the Watcher intervening to save the entire multiverse I can buy, but now he's further breaking his rule, for the sake of this one person, by dropping her off in a new timeline, roping an unnecessary timeline into his tampering. That is certainly out of character. especially when last episode, he wouldn't so much as tell Clint to look one more box over to find the things that can stop Ultron. The Watcher has a closing monologue, then after the stylized credits, there's a mid-credit scene where Natasha shows Peggy the Hydra Stomper and says there's someone inside, setting up for an episode in Season 2. Okay, now that we're done, back on the
You foresaw every moment.
thing. Nah. Nope. I'm not accepting that. This episode thinks it can worm its way out of the awful choices the Watcher makes with, he knew it would work out, but that doesn't work for multiple reasons. The Watcher cannot tell the future. He is surprised by Infinity Ultron's existence, twice. He did not see either of those coming. He cares about the fate of the multiverse enough to intervene to save it in this episode, so if he could see the future, surely he wouldn't narrate over Infinity Ultron's timeline, which would then allow Infinity Ultron to escape and start ravaging the multiverse. Well, he shouldn't be doing that anyway, because Strange heard him earlier, so now he should know narrating over powerful beings can lead to interfering, but whatever. So even if the Watcher can see the future to some degree, it's not entirely certain, which then leads to another problem for how he went about this. The end result is Killmonger and Zola fighting over the stones for eternity in this little bubble, being watched over by Strange Supreme, even though Killmonger is just a human and will die eventually, which means Infinity Ultron is going to be released again, just with Zola at the helm this time. Or, Strange Supreme steps in, takes the stones, and starts doing his own thing. After all, if Thanos can rewrite everything using the stones like he plans to in Endgame, Strange could absolutely use them to bring back Christine. It would be downright out of character for him not to take that chance, rather than just watching over these two as the Watcher expects him to. And that's all assuming his plan for beating Infinity Ultron was guaranteed, which is an extreme amount of leeway to give to the writers that they did not earn through any sort of legwork. There were definitely much better options, which I already talked about in this video, that would have had much higher certainty as well as fewer casualties, as the Watcher let Ultron rampage the multiverse for a good while. So no, the "you foresaw everything" line does not explain all of the Watcher's bizarre decisions I already mentioned, like the absolutely awful team he chose, or things I didn't mention, like having such limited involvement rather than joining the fight himself, or choosing to go with the Infinity Crusher plan, knowing that it wouldn't work. That was such an unnecessary step in the process. Pretty much no decision the Watcher makes in this episode has any sense to it. I would consider him character assassinated in this episode, because he supposedly knows a ton and cares about the multiverse. If these things were true, he wouldn't go about saving it in such a dumb, counterproductive way. This is just a direct character assassination, because this version of the Watcher is the only one, but I'm adding him to the count anyway. The Watcher's plan is so bad that surely the Guardians of the Multiverse could have come up with a better one. Every single one of them is going along with this terrible plan when there are far better options at their disposal, like taking a better stone instead of the Soul Stone, grabbing multiple stones instead of just the Soul Stone, having Strange Supreme take the stones with telekinesis, attacking Ultron from multiple sides rather than one at a time, and more. For that, every single character here is out of character, because they're supposed to be competent or even smart characters. Well, except Party Thor, I guess. He's in character for being that dumb. And with all the awful decisions Infinity Ultron makes in this episode, he's assassinated too. Again. Like, at least last episode he repeatedly won, and used way better strategies than he did here. He could summon an army of sub-Ultron bots, or blow up the planet. Instead, he makes poor choices of how to fight the Guardians of the Multiverse constantly. He's even dumber than he was last episode. But speaking of Infinity Ultron, this episode wraps up the conflict in a neat little bow, acting as if Infinity Ultron is defeated for good. There's one slight problem with that, namely the point of the whole show. Infinity Ultron became aware of the multiverse while in a timeline. He went across the multiverse, visiting timelines. The final battle occurred in a timeline. And you know what happens to timelines in the MCU? They branch. So Infinity Ultron being defeated isn't even true. This show and the Watcher overlook the fact that these timelines with him in them will just branch, bringing new Infinity Ultrons. The multiverse is not safe just because you beat this one version of him. I consider this fight the worst fight in the MCU, or just, like, ever. The Watcher's plan is nonsense. The team he chooses to fight one of the most powerful beings in the multiverse doesn't make any sense, but they still win because Infinity Ultron is heavily nerfed, constantly put on pause, and doesn't use any of his many methods of just immediately winning. Every step of the way, he's making a poor choice. Even a lot of the stuff I just briefly touched on are massive issues that break the entire episode, like the Infinity Stones being exposed when he could have easily built a layer of armor over them. The way the fight actually gets won is one of the most nonsensical writing moments I have ever seen. The stakes of the fight are basically non-existent, because nobody is using the strategies or powers that they should, and it never seems like a struggle. The overpowered protection spell makes it so that nobody even gets hurt. I recently made a video analyzing an episode of a different Marvel animation show. You might remember it. In that video, I said one of the reasons for making it was to have something to compare this episode to. I would recommend watching that video, or at least watching X-Men 97 before this part if you haven't. I do spoil things later than episode 5 in this segment. Let's begin that comparison, shall we? The reason I chose Remember It as my comparison is because both episodes set up then execute a sort of boss battle where multiple of our protagonists go up against one very powerful foe. And just about everything What If gets wrong, X-Men gets right. To start, both episodes very early on establish why our protagonists are present. For X-Men 97, Magneto says about Gambit,
"He insisted on coming after Rogue agreed to join me at the gala."
Boom. All three characters' presence sufficiently justified in a single sentence. Magneto is here because, as we see later, he was invited to the gala because the council decided to propose that he be Chancellor of Genosha. So in turn, he invited Rogue along with him because the two have been spending time together earlier this season, and because should he be asked to get involved in politics, he thinks she is more empathetic and thus better suited for the role. Or at the very least, he would do better with her at his side. Gambit, seeing the two of them going off, didn't like that because of the growing suspicions he's been having about something going on between Magneto and Rogue that would mess up his current relationship with Rogue, as limited as it is compared to what he wants it to be. And with these three in Genosha, they are the ones that primarily take place in this fight because most of the other powerful mutants were taken out in the initial blast, which Magneto and Rogue survived due to Magneto's ability to shield himself and Rogue's extremely high durability. And Gambit walked off from the gala where the initial blast was fired, which in turn allowed him to survive long enough for Nightcrawler to grab him and take him where Nightcrawler would take Magneto and Rogue later. In What If, the Watcher chooses the protagonists of each of the episodes because they were the protagonists of each of the episodes. His justification is,
"This mission requires a team, the perfect combination of skills and experience that alone will triumph."
But this is a terrible combination of skills and experience to take on such an immensely powerful threat. Many of these choices are ineffective compared to the far more powerful options out there in the multiverse. And Killmonger is actually useless other than fighting Zola for the stones at the end, which is maybe the dumbest part of a thoroughly dumb plan. After that is the establishment of stakes, which in What If's case is barely done because of course all the timelines being destroyed is a bad thing. Literally everything is in it. Well, technically according to future stuff, oh whatever, don't worry about it. As for the characters, well, there's not really much done to make you care about them, which is partially the fault of earlier episodes, but also this one. There is not even a single line from a character talking about who is waiting for them back in their own timeline or anything like that. It entirely relies on you caring about these characters themselves, based almost entirely on their poorly written prior episodes, and they range from morally reprehensible to obnoxious to bland to literally not a part of the season. X-Men has to do a lot of work to establish the stakes because Genosha is quite an unknown element. It showed up a few times in the original show, but not much is known about what it was like after Magneto turned it into a safe haven for mutants. So the episode does a lot of work to show what Genosha is like and how great and hopeful it is for mutant kind. And it shows that its residents are largely non-combatants who wouldn't be prepared to save themselves if attacked. As for the characters, Rogue and Gambit we obviously care about because they're part of the main heroes in earlier episodes of the show, as well as the previous show. But just that's not enough. This episode thoroughly emphasizes and deepens their importance to each other so that we know just how devastated they would be were the other to die. Magneto is an interesting case because, in the original show, while not entirely unsympathetic, he was often the bad guy because of how anti-human his mentality was. There is certainly no shortage of stuff to condemn him for. So getting us to care about this guy is no easy task. He's pretty thoroughly a bad dude, right? Well, the show has Magneto admit,
"My past is too littered with error,"
and give his best attempt to take the place of Charles, valuing coexistence with humanity and leading the X-Men to do things like save Madeline and Nathan from Mr. Sinister. Sometimes he struggles hard to accept the weight that has been placed on his shoulders, but every step of the way, especially in this episode, he has been willing to take it further and not back down, no matter how unfit he thinks he is for the role, or how much he thinks he doesn't deserve the future he is shouldering. And this episode shows that when it comes down to it, he can be heroic. He won't give up on his promise to Leech that he will never be afraid again, and he is willing to put himself in the line of fire to save mutant lives. Even if you don't like Magneto because of what he's done, it is at least incredibly gripping to watch just how much a flawed man can go beyond his old mindset to push for a better future, and you don't want to see that cut short. Plus, Rogue still cares about him even if she doesn't want to get back together with him, so it would be tragic for her as well if he died. I guess you could try to make a similar argument for Strange Supreme if you like his character, but for one, I don't think there is any good legwork to make you care about him or his story, considering the numerous terrible and out-of-character decisions that are far more selfish than he should be at that point in his story, and far dumber than he ever was. And also, he has nothing to lose, as he says at the end of this episode, so him dying isn't really stakes to be invested in either. Even though the prior setup for What If wasn't good for establishing why we should care about these characters, they could have at least had them show any kind of concern for the other members of their team when they are in danger. But nah, they don't even do that. And then when the fights actually happen, the stakes are felt in X-Men because they kill off multiple minor characters and destroy a large portion of Genosha before killing Gambit and seemingly Magneto, which are very immediately impactful to Rogue and very impactful throughout the rest of the show. In What If, nobody dies, and it feels like nothing happened, because the only impact is Killmonger being trapped forever due to his own choices, but like, he's a villain who deserves it. And the only other person who has to make any sort of sacrifice is Strange Supreme, who's tasked with watching Killmonger and Zola, but he didn't have any life to give up to do this anyway. Imagine the narrative potential if somebody did die here, and the Watcher had to reconcile with that, and what effect that would have on their timeline. But nah, taking narrative opportunities is lame. There's not even an acknowledgement that Killmonger's timeline is tampered with now that he's not going back. And everyone else's timeline is tampered with now that they know about the multiverse. As for power scaling, X-Men 97 has very clearly established power levels that it sticks to. Magneto has the ability to manipulate metal, and his magnetic powers also allow him to form multiple types of shields that can protect himself and others from harm. Rogue's relevant abilities here are flight, super strength, and super durability. Gambit has enhanced agility and the ability to activate potential energy in things so that they become explosive. Each of them uses these powers in ways that make sense, such as Rogue throwing a Sentinel head with Gambit on it so that he can quickly get to the Morlocks. And of course all your usual stuff, like Gambit throwing explosive cards, and Magneto attacking with metal things. The Godzilla Sentinel they're up against is established to be incredibly strong, using multiple types of lasers to destroy buildings and kill mutants on a scale never seen before, dispensing many regular Sentinels, and being very durable to the point where Gambit says it can't be dented, which is verified when Magneto can't seem to do any serious damage to it either. However, it seems to only be able to focus on one foe at a time, which allows Magneto to distract it, dodging and shielding himself from some of its blasts, so that Rogue and Gambit only have to fight regular Sentinels, which they can take out with ease, and Rogue shields Gambit from fire from above, because he's not durable enough to survive it. The only breaches to support our heroes are Gambit's bike being way faster than it should be, and the giant sentinel shooting in front of him rather than at him, which allows him to scale up to it. But that allows for a creative last-ditch use of Gambit's powers, where after being stabbed by the sentinel, he lights it up and blows it up using his powers. At a scale we haven't seen before, but also not one that would have been necessary before, as it requires getting up close and personal with a foe that Gambit could easily just throw an explosive object at, subjecting himself to the explosion in the process. The fight in totality is not perfect, but it is largely very consistent. Now compare that to What If, where, well, I just spent the whole video explaining how bad the power scaling is. At best, it's incredibly nebulous, with things like the protection spell protecting everyone from ever getting hurt, and Doctor Strange pulling out a new move to answer literally anything Ultron does, and at worst, it's just blatantly wrong, because Ultron needs to be repeatedly nerfed for the Guardians of the Multiverse to stand a chance. If he was allowed to use his powers intelligently, and be as strong as he's shown to be, then he would have won this fight 1,000 times over. I could get into characterization and theme, but at that point it doesn't even seem fair. One episode of X-Men 97 manages to develop complex conflicts between multiple different groups of characters, making thematic points about the pains that come with being stuck between two romances, or getting caught up on things that are only skin deep, while also tying into the show's main themes about how to handle the past and the future. And that's not even all the episode does. What If snatches up a bunch of caricatures, then has them fight each other with occasional bits of banter in between. Any actual character stuff it tries to do is minor, and either shallow, like Peggy briefly being conflicted about returning to 2014 because she wants to be with Steve again, then deciding that she's needed in 2014, or completely inconsistent, like the Watcher choosing to place Natasha in a timeline that isn't hers, thus interfering with that timeline for way less of a valid reason than the entire multiverse's impending doom. Then, as close to a thematic point as it gets, is the Watcher at the end of the episode saying,
That's it, isn't it? All creatures searching for a place to belong, to call home.
Which is so shallow, obvious, and isn't even really related to the events of the episode. Then there's the extra touches, like meaningful shots and symbolism, which What If doesn't even attempt. To be fair, X-Men 97 has a much better grasp on symbolism than any other piece of superhero media I've ever seen. But that's just another win that makes the chasm between these two episodes that much wider. Remember It is a way more effective boss fight, and a way more effective episode, because it did the work to make sure everything was properly set up, consistent in terms of plot and character, and impactful, even if it had a few small missteps. And don't even get me started comparing X-Men 97's finale to how this episode fares as a finale, because Tolerance is Extinction Part 3 is an even better episode than Remember It, and easily sweeps the finale of every other MCU show. I would argue that episode is some of, if not the best, the superhero genre has to offer. So how did this even happen? How did the same studio make two shows where one knows how to properly set up and execute a big battle, and the other completely falls on its face? Well, to dispense of the excuses people always make for What If, the 30-ish minute episode length is not a debilitating barrier that prevents them from having good storytelling. Both of these episodes are 36 minutes, and yet one achieves so much that I talked about its strengths for an hour, and the other is so empty that I broke down in detail all of its events and its many failings, and it took shorter than that. The fact that it's an animated superhero show supposedly for kids isn't preventing them from having good storytelling either. Both shows are animated superhero shows and fall under the same age rating, and there are plenty of movies that have amazing stories despite being suitable for kids. What If being based on comics is not an excuse either. Even if you think comics are just bad, which, while sometimes true, is not entirely the case. Both of these adapt the comics with a fair amount of artistic liberty taken, and X-Men 97 still manages to be great while being based on the comics. It's just meant to be entertaining isn't an excuse either, because it's hard for me to be entertained when so little effort was put into the writing, and none of the episode makes sense. As I explained in the comparison, there is a lot more of a reason to get invested when the stakes are clearly set up and power levels stay consistent so that the conflicts aren't just solved by nonsense. Even if you don't care about the writing, it certainly doesn't hurt to have good writing, You can have something that is both well written and entertaining, like X-Men 97. A claim I've seen before is that I just went into What If and other things I critique looking to hate, which is quite funny to me because I actually liked What If when I first watched it. Back when it came out, I wasn't very critical and just generally enjoyed Marvel stuff. On the contrary, in preparation for X-Men 97, I started watching the original series, which, to be frank, was not very good and was incredibly boring to me. So pairing that with the writing quality of modern Marvel, I went in expecting it to be something bad to chat about with other people. Another Marvel show that's fun to discuss the flaws of, but nothing I would actually recommend as good content. But by the end of episode 2, my expectations were thoroughly exceeded. I realized that I was watching some of the best storytelling the MCU had put out, not just recently, but ever. And the rest of the show only continued to prove that. So, no. Going into something expecting it to be bad doesn't mean that you'll conclude that it is bad. Not that that's why I critique What If anyway. I just thought about the show a while later and realized that none of it made any sense. It's as simple as this. What If could have been a well-written show. Nothing was stopping it. This finale is not something I would consider a great idea, because it's not necessary to cross over all the prior episodes, and evidently it's not easy to justify all their main characters being here. But it didn't by any means have to be this bad. It would have taken a lot of work to justify why a regular human and 3 super soldiers are of any help when fighting an all-powerful supercomputer, but they didn't have to make the Watcher choose this team. Maybe there's some way events transpired such that this happened to be the team that could be there. In the same way Remember It has its 3 characters fight the Sentinel just because they were present when it attacked. Maybe it's on the writers for not putting in enough thought, and when it comes down to the execution of smaller stuff, it absolutely is. And maybe it's on the higher-ups for mandating things that are incredibly difficult to justify while maintaining the story's integrity. But whatever the case, this finale is a thoroughly awful story and an unquestionable 1 out of 10. The worst episode of the season, and I would argue the entire show. It's just so thoroughly broken in every single way. Wow. I didn't expect this series to take this long to make, but of course I made other stuff in the meantime, and had lots of other stuff to do outside of YouTube. That's every episode of What If Season 1 covered in detail. That's not the end of my series though, because now that I have covered in depth every episode of Season 1, and briefly every episode of the subsequent seasons, I'll be making a conclusion video on this show as a whole. What it did right, the many things it did wrong that could have been improved, correcting my mistakes from earlier videos, and fun stuff like that. So I'll see you guys in the next one, and as always, thanks for watching.